And I used to say, well, you must remember, this is Africa. This isn't little Puddleton in the marsh. And they behave differently, and they think nothing of sticking tent poles up each other's whatnot, and doing filthy, beastly things to each other. It does happen, I'm afraid. It's a very wild thing in an election.
It's the 12th of December 1979, and as Lord Somm steps off the Royal Air Force VC-10 onto the tarmac at Salisbury International Airport, the unrecognised country of Zimbabwe Rhodesia has once again fallen under British rule. Lord Somm's job is not going to be an easy one, and while the opinion of the rest of the world is that the outcome's obvious, elections to be held in February, and a transition of democratically elected majority government after that, Somm knows that the country's on the brink of disaster, and that all sides are plotting against him. The only people he knows aren't working against him are a woefully under-equipped and overextended Commonwealth force, known as the Monitoring Force. Numbering only 1,500, and expected to watch over the entire election process and the disarmament of the two main guerrilla groups, Zanla and Zipra, that both number in the tens of thousands. The first few weeks of his governorship are rocky to say the least, with law and order on the verge of collapse, and the former Rhodesian army still acting as if they run the show. But on the 28th of December, a ceasefire finally goes into effect, and things start to look a little more stable.
I mean, I had to persuade and cajole and carry along and just interfere where I thought it was all right to interfere, and sometimes close my eyes to what I would normally have liked to interfere with if I felt I'd really had the power so to do.
But assessing the situation, Somm also realises the need to get the whole process over and done with before the situation can deteriorate once again. And in his cautiousness, combined with the agreements made at Lancaster House, he's inadvertently put the entire election process in jeopardy. While during the negotiations, the guerrillas had demanded an interim government and anywhere from 6 months to a year to prepare for the election, the British had negotiated the complete opposite out of them. The elections would be held at the end of February, and Somm had decided to keep the Rhodesian government structure and staff exactly as it was before he arrived in order to streamline the entire process. Everyone who had worked at the various ministries would stay exactly where they were, and they'd carry on as usual. The only difference now being that they reported to an Englishman, who in turn reported to HM government back in London. And despite the ceasefire that was to last for the duration of the election period, the Rhodesian military was almost completely unaffected, their only major change being a stop to cross-border operations. The ceasefire agreement had been worded in a way that made the guerrillas think that the army would be confined to barracks, and that the BSAP would be the only white force on the ground assisting the monitoring force. But because of the amount of ground to cover, the lack of manpower in the police and the monitoring forces, Somm had almost the entire military out on patrol as though there were no ceasefire in effect at all, and the only insight he had into their workings were through a handful of British Army officers attached to various commands throughout the country. For all intents and purposes, the Rhodesian army and its former government were running the show, and Somm had just become a tool for them to direct their demands and displeasures to. In addition, the ceasefire had confined almost the entire guerrilla movement to 16 assembly points dotted throughout the country. Camps that, since the monitoring force was spread so thinly defending, had to be reinforced by Rhodesian troops, and even still, 2 had to be closed later on. There were of course a number of guerrillas who didn't show up to the assembly points and decided to remain hidden in the bush, but tens of thousands did actually show up, and were under the constant watch of the Commonwealth and Rhodesian forces. The only guerrilla force that was permitted to stay outside of the camps was the highest level of leadership and their bodyguards, which meant that Mugabe and Como, the top officers and a couple hundred bodyguards, as well as personal security provided by London's Met Police, were housed at the University of Rhodesia in Salisbury, though due to the bitter rivalries the majority of Zanla and Zipra contingents kept themselves separated to different parts of the campus. In short, the ceasefire had mobilised the entire Rhodesian security forces, placed them on every road and street corner, and had cornered the guerrillas into 16 well-mapped, well-surveyed camps under constant observation. Both decisions made at Lancaster House and by Somm had served up to the Rhodesians the entire guerrilla movement, and it had given them the opportunity to end the whole movement when they chose to do so.
You see, South Africa can easily move to surround our assembly points and surround our forces, therefore. You see, they are away from their bases and naturally must be in a defensive position, and South Africa will be in an offensive position. They have already expressed their, fear that we might win the elections, and their intentions that if we do, then naturally they would have to act. So they have said so.
The opportunity presented to the Rhodesians didn't pass them by, and they immediately began planning two separate operations. One to destroy the guerrillas while they had them in the palm of their hand, and the second to wipe out the leadership completely while they were trapped in a single location. These operations would be codenamed Operation Quartz and Operation Ectic. In this final showdown, there would have been actors from almost everybody and anybody with an interest in the 1980 election. The target would have been Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF and his armed wing Zanla, who had emerged as the strongest guerrilla faction in the war that was now coming to a close, and also the biggest threat at the ballot box. On the Rhodesian side, it would have included every branch of the security forces being mobilised and thrown into combat, as well as an extensive action by both the regular police and the specialist police anti-terror units and support units. Supporting it directly would be the South African Air Force, both in the form of helicopters and ground crews, and units from both the South African Army and its Special Forces branches. They would have also had some help from some very unlikely allies, both sympathetic tribal militias and Prime Minister Muzoeira's security force auxiliaries. There was also talk of having support from ZIPRA, the more moderate of the two competing guerrilla armies, who saw Mugabe as a threat equal to or more so than the whites. But then there was the wild card, the monitoring force. No one knew what they'd do in response to the beginning of the operation, or if SOMS would order them to step in at all, or if he could prevent them stepping in by themselves if they took matters into their own hands, especially when its members came from half a dozen different countries, and were under half a dozen different commands.
In recent months, there have been one or two statements which are just untrue, and I think I'd like to take this opportunity of saying that whilst I think the news media have the absolute right to state any adverse comment or opinion they might have about any person or any place or any group or any country, I don't believe they have the right to say something happened if it never happened. And ladies and gentlemen, I never attended a mutinous assembly or a riotous group of soldiers or any kind of group that didn't behave in the normal way that soldiers have behaved throughout my service. It just never happened at the Selous Scouts or anywhere else. I know the Guardian and other newspapers said it happened. It just didn't. That was a straight lie because it did not ever take place. In the same way, I never had 30 pieces of silver thrown at me. It just didn't happen, ladies and gentlemen. It was a lie. And I believe lies like that are unfair to the country, to the forces, and I believe they were unfair to me and damaging.
Whoever first came up with the idea for Quartz and Ectic, and the dates when which these names were first written down, is lost to time. But we do know that the first action that would later become relevant, whether it was integral to the plan or not, happened as far in advance as October 1979, after South Africa had impounded 8 Polish T-55s from a Libyan cargo ship, and then in secret sent them and a force of advisors to Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, where they formed E Squadron of the Rhodesian Armoured Car Regiment, under the command of a West German tanker. The exact reason for the plan has never been fully disclosed either. While some think the plan was a standard coup, others actually believe it to be a contingency plan, only to be enacted if the country finally went over the edge. The cynical answer is that Mugabe was seen as a crazed madman, and his ZANU-PF party, though expected to win a narrow popular vote victory, would be beaten by a coalition government aimed at keeping him out. No one expected him to take this news well, and believed that he'd soon after announce the resumption of his guerrilla campaign, which would force the Rhodesians to perform a preemptive strike against Zanla before they could disperse back into the bush or across the border. The second reason given is that no one trusted ZANU-PF to take a narrow defeat gracefully, and to prevent a descent into chaos as thousands of guerrillas streamed out the assembly points to take their revenge on the people of Rhodesia for not voting for them, the army would step in and guarantee safety for all, even those that were former enemies, until the situation could be stabilised, and again, a coalition government would be formed. The third, almost purely military version, is that the security forces feared a complete breakdown in security, either before, during, or in the immediate aftermath of the election, and would have to step in to restore order, using this opportunity to also eliminate the guerrilla forces. Operation Quartz would be the big picture operation. A code word would be sent out either just before or as the election results were announced, and upon hearing the code word, the entirety of the Rhodesian security forces would move into action. Strategic towns and roads would be taken and fortified, 3 fire zones would be cleared, and strategic infrastructure that couldn't easily be defended was to be abandoned, potentially rendered useless to guerrillas. The Rhodesian Air Force was to be deployed en masse and commence saturation bombing both of the Zanla camps and the 2 mixed camps. It's not inconceivable that given the troubles the Rhodesian Air Force had with supplying their aircraft, that this was going to use up a large majority of its remaining bomb and rocket stocks. After the bombing were complete, the RLI, supported by 4 of the new T-55s in Bulawayo, the SAS and the Sealer Scouts would comb the camps for survivors, possibly rescuing Zipra members when and where they came across them. They were then spread out and sweep the surrounding countryside, hunting down any who had escaped before moving on to those who had remained outside the camps. To assist with this, the South African Army was to deploy additional troops to Beitbridge and the surrounding areas. More helicopters would be seconded to the Rhodesians to support their efforts, in both a recon capacity and in moving the vast number of hunter-killer groups around the country. And finally, the 1st Reconnaissance Commando were to be deployed to provide additional tracking groups in the bush. There is no record of what were planned to be done with the Commonwealth troops in the country. Operation Hectic was a planned attack on the University of Rhodesia by the A, B and C squadrons of the Rhodesian SAS and supported by the Rhodesian Armoured Car Regiment. They were equipped with Eland armoured cars, a collection of 106mm recoilless rifles, and the rest of the T-55s. The T-55s had been modified with spotlights, and they were loaded down with additional boxes of ammunition for both the commander's gun and the gunner's coaxial gun. The tanks had been transported to King George VI barracks from Cabrit in anticipation for the operation, and upon hearing the code word, along with the rest of the vehicles, would move into Salisbury and surround the university's campus. They had then split up and attack separate targets. A Squadron were to find and eliminate Mugabe, B Squadron were to eliminate Simon Mazenda, Mugabe's vice president, and his 100-men contingent at the Medical Arts Centre. These groups were to be supported by the Eland armoured cars. C Squadron had the biggest task. They were to take on the 200 men at the Audio-Visual Arts building. The T-55s would stay on the street outside the university and overwhelm the building with upwards of 80 high explosive shells before the command tank were to ram the campus walls. C Squadron, under Bob Mackenzie, would flood the campus and take over what were left of the building. They'd been specifically issued with AK-47s, stun grenades and body armour for the task, and as they cleared each room, were to drape sheets from the window, indicating each cleared room to the supporting tanks. Sources can't seem to agree on whether Zipra leadership were to be spared during the attack, but his fighters were to be allowed to flee, as long as they didn't fight back. And again, no mention is made of the fate of the British police officers stationed at the university.
But most of tonight's programme is about Rhodesia, where, to remind you briefly, Robert Mugabe's party won an absolute majority, many more seats than anybody expected. Mr. Nkomo took second place, and Bishop Muzorewa came a poor third.
But with just 3 hours to go before the operation was set to begin, Operation Quartz and Hectic were cancelled. Mugabe and ZANU-PF had taken the election in a landslide, and over the following years a number of theories have been given as to why the operation was cancelled. These include an intelligence leak. The Rhodesian High Command leaked like a sieve, and many men of English descent had mixed loyalties. London often knew everything the Rhodesians knew almost instantly, and when necessary they fed that information to its Commonwealth ally Zambia, who in turn would alert the guerrillas and in many cases save them at the very last second. One name at the very top has been identified as a possible source: Kim Flower, the head of the Rhodesian Central Intelligence Organisation. This theory is supported by Lieutenant Colonel Garth Barrett, who was the commanding officer of the Rhodesian SAS at the time. There's also the possibility that with Zipra playing an unspecified role in the operation, that someone in the organisation is informed, and then in turn informed Zanla. This leak became known to the Rhodesians and they cancelled the plan. Regardless, Mugabe himself was well aware of the plots against him, and a meeting with General Walls just before the election had asked him, "Why are your men trying to kill me?" But Walls replied simply along the lines of, "If it were my men trying to kill you, they wouldn't have missed." The other most plausible theory is that the Rhodesians had vastly underestimated ZANU-PF's influence, and when the results started coming in, Walls simply couldn't justify going up against a force that, at least on the surface, was supported by 63% of the country, especially when Muzorewa, the candidates the whites were relying on as their guy, got 8.3%. It appeared to them that there was simply absolutely no will to continue the fight. It has also been suggested that the plan itself was a false flag. The Rhodesian military had in the past been aware of a desire among some officers to take over the country and once again return it to white minority rule. So General Walls spread the plan amongst the entire military to give the renegades something to look forward to, and so they wouldn't act out on their own. This is even backed up by Walls' appearance on television soon after the operation was cancelled, when he shut down the idea of anyone carrying on with the plan of their own accord, and saying, quote, "Anyone who gets out of line, or for whatever reason starts disobeying the law, will be dealt with effectively and swiftly."
When push came to shove, Walls took the right decision right the way down the line, including deciding that he would not support a coup at the end, and there was much pressure, I have no doubt, put on him for that.
I have already given him our assurance that we do not intend to disrupt the services as they are. If we are going to effect any changes, this will take some time.
I said to him, but how can I, as an avowed anti-Marxist, work for a person like you? And he said, well, you must know, General, that the teachings of Karl Marx are identical to those of Jesus Christ. And I said, I can't possibly accept that, but I can't argue with you on an intellectual thing like that now.
In the end, the plan was quietly shelved, and the records were ordered to be destroyed, though some copies do exist in various collections. Those who stayed on the independent Zimbabwean military kept a low profile, but in July, following a BBC interview in which Walls mentioned attempts to nullify the election, he became a much-needed distraction from the first farm murder to take post-independent Zimbabwe, and he left the country for South Africa soon after. But whatever the possible outcome, it didn't happen in the end. And it's become a largely forgotten about what if that I hope has been interesting to hear about. This video took a lot of research, and I read a number of books and articles about the war, both at the big picture level and the individual level, and these will be listed below. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I'm glad I finally got to finish one of these longer projects, and any feedback is appreciated, and I hope you'll stick around for more weird footnotes from history.